Thank you so much for having me. Speaking into your May theme, awakening curiosity and exploring new perspectives. I'm Dr. Kurt Johnson, among many, many other hats, from the interspirituality.com website, from the United Nations community here in New York, and also from the Light on Light Press, about which I'll be telling you a bit more in a moment. And we're going to be sharing about our celebrating the 25th anniversary of the interspiritual paradigm. And if you want to ask briefly, what is the interspiritual paradigm? It's very simple in the sense you're all familiar with interfaith and the relationship of all the world's religions. And interspirituality is really generally just defined as the sharing of all of the wisdom resources of all of the global traditions throughout history. And what's unique about this time is that we live in a time where all of the wisdom resources of all of the world's wisdom traditions are all on the table, all at the same time. And all you have to do is turn on your television to know how important this is, because if we remember back to the founding of the United Nations, a statement by theologian Hans Küng, where he said, and it's so powerful today, there can be no peace among the nations until there is peace among the religions. And we know that we're still a long way from the realization of that goal. Now, 2025 and 2026 were this 25th anniversary, because right at the turning of the century, we had 5 major global interfaith leaders who actually gave a name to the deeper relationship of all the world's religions as the interspiritual paradigm. And one was Thomas Merton, who called it the communion of that sense of mystery and awe. Raymond Panicara, the great Spanish theologian, who called it the intra-religious experience. Matthew Fox, the Catholic theologian, who I'm sure you all know, who also called it deep ecumenism. And then Thich Nhat Hanh, of course, who all of you know of, called it our interbeing. And then Wayne Teasdale, who many of you know, and I'll be saying so much more about, actually coined the term interspirituality in his book, which is really now a classic, The Mystic Heart, Discovering a Universal Spirituality in the World's Religions. And that happened to be the name that stuck, that everybody has continued to use. Now, on this 25th anniversary, the Light on Light Press, which I just mentioned, which I'm one of the founders of, and we've been so fortunate to do so many wonderful books. We've won 9 Nautilus Awards and Nautilus's Award for Best in Small Press in 2024. But we're so pleased to have done these 2 books on the 25th anniversary of the Interspiritual Paradigm. And the first volume is Interspirituality, the Heritage. And the second volume is Interspirituality, the Future. And the titles and subtitles tell it all. Where has this come from? And where is it going? And this includes over 120 global interfaith and spiritual leaders from around the world contributing, and with a opening message from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So fitting, because he actually wrote the foreword to Wayne Teasdale's original book on discovering the universal spirituality in the world's religions. And with the foreword by Matthew Fox, who, as I said, was one of the namers of the paradigm with his term, deep ecumenism. And then the afterword by Colorado's own and integral philosopher Ken Wilber, who I'm sure many of you know so well, doing the afterword. So both books are both a chronological and thematic history of this 25-year growth from interfaith, which is more about ideas and sharing and more about the head, and the move then to the heart and to the mystical and the deep connection of everything, which is really what interspirituality is about. And this is really, really close to Colorado's history, I think, as many of you know so well, because one of the foundations for all of this work was headed by Father Thomas Keating out of the St. Benedict's Abbey in Snowmass, where he hosted for several decades what became known as the Snowmass Interreligious Dialogues. And from those meetings came two really iconic and worldly important concepts. One that was published in his book, The Common Heart, which was the 9 points of agreement among the world's religions. And remember, like I said, quoting Hans Kung, when Hans Kung said at the founding of the United Nations, there can be no peace among the nations until there is peace among the religions. So that document, the 9 points of agreement among the world's religions, was truly foundational, published in the book from the Snowmass Dialogues in 2007, entitled The Common Heart. And from the 9 points of agreement among the world's religions, then came Wayne Teasdale's 9 elements of a universal spirituality. And actually, what Wayne was answering when he wrote the 9 elements was, if all of the world's religions agreed on the 9 points of agreement about what religion's really about with regard to its shared values, then how would we behave? And so the 9 elements of the universal spirituality are really all about behavior. Obviously, we're behaving differently than how we see people when we turn on the TV and we see all of this conflict and violence. But this is really the bottom line, as you all know, is how do we go from this conflictual nature that's such a part of our history, and I'll be saying more about that in a moment, to the deeper part of our values, which is championed by all the world's religions, which have to do with love and care and compassion, co-creativity, reciprocity, mutuality, and partnership. If we don't get there, we're going to have a perilous future. If we actually could get there, this world could actually be a paradise. So the two things that we really want to explore just a bit as I go through spending 15, 20 minutes with you are, what was the original vision of the interspiritual pioneers? And what could we say turned out a bit differently than they expected? Like when we turn on our TV today, we don't exactly see that world of harmony and that they were working toward and pointing toward. So we really want to ask, what is it that they didn't expect? And given that, we also want to take a look at what are the directions that we want to go now. Because since the publication of these volumes, so many of these 120 featured authors in the books have been meeting regularly. And this is what we've been talking about. Where is it that we want to go from here to get to the types of shared values that we're actually talking about? So what the original founders of interspirituality expected, and I think what many of you expected, particularly people in my age group, we thought that when we had gone through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, that we'd made a tremendous amount of progress toward a progressive worldview that would have to do with getting along and with partnership and with high values and sharing and caring and all of those values that are really the foundation of the world's religions. And from that, we could have a real meaningful dialogue and even rapprochement among all of the great isms of the world. And I think many of you know, when you read books like The Cultural Creatives or Paul Hawkins' book on thousands and thousands of organizations in the world doing good work in the world, we really thought that we were getting there. Now, what wasn't expected were really 3 things, and we really mentioned these in the volumes. That the first thing that was not expected was the disaffiliation from the world's religions themselves, a great leaving of the religions by so many thousands and millions around the world. Even though those establishments themselves stayed in place, then you actually had all of their buildings empty and people no longer really referring to those core values that were a part of those great isms. So not only did disaffiliation happen, but as you know, particularly for young people, there's really no way that they can quickly access the heritage of these deep values that were a part of the world's religions. And instead, as I'll say more about in a moment, that's been replaced by so much misinformation, disinformation, negativity, and all kinds of darkness that really is all over the internet and social media. Now, the other thing that they didn't expect was the rise of nationalist populism around the world and the move away from democracy and toward authoritarianism based on leaders, as Pope Leo said recently, really tyrants who are using conflict and pitting one group against another and one nation against another, really to enrich themselves or to gain their own political or ego-driven narcissistic goals. So the resurgence around the world of what was called nationalist populism, which of course we see in the United States with Christian nationalism and us against them and all of that, that was really very much not anticipated by the interspiritual pioneers. Now, the third thing that they didn't expect, which is huge, and that is what we refer to now, and you're all familiar with it, is the disinformation and misinformation era. Once the internet and social media really took over our attention, and we really moved from print media to screen media, which was far less reflective. We went from print media where people were thinking, they were being reflective, they were really analyzing, and they were talking about facts and what was meaningful, to all kinds of crazy stuff on the internet, so much of which is not true, misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. And this actually is such a problem that a group of 100 sociologists last year called this an evolutionary catastrophe. And what they mean by an evolutionary catastrophe, by science's definition, is something that so upsets the norm that you really have no idea how you would get back to that normal again. And so we're really in that situation now, which is really so difficult. Turned out to be quite a bit different than what the interspiritual pioneers, where they thought we were going. So in the many meetings that we're having now, as we really take a look at all this and we ask the question, what is ours to do as global interfaith leaders, global interspiritual leaders? And it's interesting, I think Pope Leo is doing such an amazing job with regard to these values, is we really have defined 4 things that we really think are the message of the future if we're going to actually have a thriving future and a future that could really serve everybody in this world. Now, the first one is the message of interfaith and interspirituality itself. And that is simply, as I said at the beginning, the relationship of all of the world's wisdom traditions and their foundational sets of values with regard to love and care, sharing, partnership, co-creativity, reciprocity, mutuality. Those themes, which are at the heart of the world's religions in the first place, are really the first drum that we have to continue beating. The next drum that we have to continue beating, we call it all things eco. All things that have to do with eco and eco-spirituality. Everything about conventional environmental concern, climate change, and so on, but also the spiritual understanding of our relationship to nature, our reciprocity with nature, what was understood by first peoples and what in that traditions are called the original instructions of living in harmony with nature. And also this has to do with everything that refers to Mother Earth and Mother Gaia. And notice that I'm bringing the feminine in there because this really has to do with the message of the divine feminine and the way of caring and the way of caring about the world. So everything, all things eco, that's the other thing that we have to continue to have in our messaging. The third thing that's important in our messaging, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this from your own personal experiences, attention to the subtle realms, attentions to the deeper parts of our nature. And not only as that's understood by spirituality and all of the mystical traditions, but also how it's understood by modern science and modern physics in the sense of holographic principles, non-locality, entanglement, all of those fancy words that have to do with the profound interconnection of everything in the cosmos and who we are, and our attention to the subtle relationships we have with ourselves and with others. The fourth dimension and the fourth drum that we have to continue to beat, we're defining now, is really how we move from domination consciousness and domination culture, which is exactly what runs the world, politics, business, all of these things are domination hierarchies, which are win-lose. Someone comes out on top, someone comes out on the bottom. We have to move from domination consciousness and domination culture to partnership consciousness and partnership culture. Those would be cultures that would be based in the foundational principles of the world's religions. And I think you know one of the great feminine voices in the world, Rihanna Eisler, has really been the person who's been pioneering this understanding of what's called the domination to partnership spectrum. And it's really the bottom line of everything that's not right with the world right now. If we can't move from domination hierarchies to partnership in culture at all levels, and it's such a huge dream, it's way out there, but that's just where we would have to get if we were not only going to survive, but also to thrive. Now, the last thing I'll say, because I see I really have about 4 minutes left here, I'm going to harken back to a meeting that I was able to attend just before COVID with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala in India, with myself and a number of other, global interfaith leaders who are also scientists. I think you know my PhD is in evolution, and my background is 25 years at the American Museum of Natural History and Evolution and Ecology. And this meeting with the Dalai Lama was about the future of science for humanity and spirituality for humanity. And what we noted is that in 2015, in mainstream science, there was a redefinition of evolution by natural selection. I think all of you know that Darwin's theory originally got coined as survival of the fittest, and that the measure of fitness was who was the best competitor, whose dominance hierarchy could win out. And this was because science had not really had a way to study groups. Now, when we got supercomputers and lots of other methodologies and studied how groups make decisions, we found out that groups don't make selfish decisions, but groups make decisions for the good of the whole. So the redefinition of natural selection and evolution that happened around 2015 in books from Yale and Templeton and many, many others was that partnership and collaboration and cooperation are just as important to natural selection as competition. In fact, competition happens at the most primitive levels of evolution. And as things complexify, the definition of fitness changes from competition to cooperation. So this was huge. And that led to the recognition, as the Dalai Lama said there, and the scientists there, that actually for the first time potentially in history, the view of science of moving toward a world that works for all and the world of the world's religions moving toward a world that works for all are really on the same track. And what they concluded then was that in a global future, if we could have the type of future that we're talking about here, it would be science's job to tell us how evolution works. Because if we're living as a species on this planet and we're living in a way that's not in tune with how evolutionary process actually works, we're simply going to dead end. And of course, then what religions and the wisdom traditions can bring to that is the statements about values and behavior that guide us toward living in that way that could bring us to that future that we're talking about, that is about reciprocity, mutuality, co-creativity, love, care, and all of those things. So I've been watching the clock in the background. We're just right now at about 20 minutes. And so I just want to say it's been absolutely wonderful to be here with you. I hope you'll take a look at these books, Interspirituality, the Heritage, Interspirituality, the Future. I just want to commend you for everything that you're doing in your work. We're all dreaming the same dream. We're all dreaming and sharing those same values together. So I hope the things that I've shared, and particularly the points that I've talked about in the sense of what wasn't expected, what appears to have gone a bit wrong and put us in kind of the mess we're in today, but the direction that we can go in the future, which is so consistent with exactly the theme that you're talking about this month, and the themes those 4 themes I talked about that could get us to that world. So thank you very much for having me. Pardon me while I'm going to have to look away to find the button to stop recording, but it's been wonderful to spend this 20 minutes with you, and thank you so much.